The sound of rain tapping against the windowpane set the stage for a tale that would stay with you long after you heard it. A young boy, no more than 7, sat alone in a dimly lit room. His small hands clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and faded. The boy's name was Marcus. His eyes, dark and reflective, told a story of longing, of pain, and of hope that one day someone would see him for who he was. But for now, he was invisible, tucked away in a foster home where love was nothing more than a word tossed around casually, never truly felt. This wasn't just any foster home. This was the home of a woman named Eleanor, a name that evoked feelings of dread for every child who passed through her doors. She wore a mask of kindness for the outside world, but inside her home, her true colors bled through like ink on a damp page. Eleanor was meticulous, cold, and demanding, but her cruelty seemed to reserve its sharpest edges for Marcus. He was different. His skin was darker than the other children who had come before him, and to Eleanor, that difference was unforgivable. From the moment Marcus arrived, it was clear he was not welcome. His meals were smaller, his chores were harder, and his punishments were harsher. He learned quickly that his tears would earn him no sympathy. "Toughen up," Eleanor would sneer, her lips curling into a smirk. "No one's going to care about a boy like you." Those words echoed in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. Despite the darkness of his world, Marcus had a light within him that refused to be extinguished. At night, when the house was quiet, he would close his eyes and imagine a different life, a life where he was valued, where he was loved. He dreamed of growing up, leaving this place behind, and proving to the world and to Eleanor that he was more than the labels she had pinned to him. Years passed, and Marcus's dreams became his driving force. He worked harder in school than anyone expected. He read every book he could get his hands on, teaching himself about the world beyond the walls of Eleanor's home. And when the day finally came for him to leave, he walked out the door with nothing but a backpack and an unshakable determination to succeed. Life wasn't easy after that. Marcus faced struggles that would have broken most people, but he never let himself fall. Slowly, he built a life for himself, one brick at a time. He went to college, started a career, and eventually became someone even he could be proud of. The scars of his past lingered, but they no longer defined him. Then one day, out of the blue, a name from the past resurfaced: Eleanor. Marcus was now an adult, living a life far removed from the boy he once was, but the sound of her name still made his chest tighten. She was in trouble, people said. Her health was failing, and her once pristine home had become a shadow of its former self. She needed help that only Marcus could provide. When Marcus received the call, he didn't know what to think. The woman who had once made him feel so small was now reaching out to him, desperate for his kindness. He could have ignored her plea. He could have walked away, just as she had so many times when he needed her most. But Marcus was not the same person Eleanor had once known. He was stronger, wiser, and most importantly, he had the power to decide how this story would end. And that's where we pick up today. What will Marcus do? Will he confront Eleanor with the pain she caused? Or will he rise above it, showing her a compassion she never showed him? The answer lies ahead, in a story of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable spirit of a boy who became a man. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss what happens next. Marcus stood by the window of his small apartment, staring out at the bustling city streets below. He had come a long way since those dark days in Eleanor's home, and yet the weight of the past still hung over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The rain that had softly pattered on his window earlier now raged in full force, as though mirroring the storm inside him. The message had been simple, just a voicemail, short and to the point, but it was enough to send his mind reeling. "Marcus," Eleanor's voice crackled through the phone. I need your help. Please, I don't know who else to turn to. I'm sick. The doctors say it's bad, and I don't have much time left. I know we've never seen eye to eye, but I'm asking, no, begging, for your help. Please." Her words had sent a chill down his spine, a sense of disbelief washing over him. Eleanor, the woman who had tormented him for years, was now asking for his help. He had long since left her world behind, cutting all ties the moment he had the chance. The thought of helping her, of showing her any kindness, seemed almost impossible. After everything she had done to him, everything she had taken from him, why would he even consider it? But the more Marcus thought about it, the more his anger turned to confusion. Why was she reaching out now, after all these years? Why wasn't she turning to the other children she fostered over the years, the ones who had likely stayed in touch, the ones who might have cared? No, this wasn't about her health. This wasn't just a simple request for help. There was something else, something deeper at play. He paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. Marcus knew he couldn't ignore the call. Whether he liked it or not, his past had come back to find him. He had spent years building a new life, a life that felt solid and secure, but he realized that no matter how far he had run, the echoes of his childhood would always follow him. He couldn't escape the truth, no matter how much he wanted to. Eleanor had shaped him in ways he wasn't even fully aware of yet. But what did she want? Why him? Why now? The questions weighed on him, pulling him in different directions. In his mind, he ran through all the possible scenarios. Part of him wanted to turn his back completely, to let her deal with her own mess. She had never cared about him when he needed her most. She had made his life a living nightmare, so why should he offer her the decency of a response? But another part of him, the part that had always dreamed of proving everyone wrong, wondered if there was something more to this. Maybe she was reaching out for a reason. Maybe there was something she had kept hidden all these years, something he had never known about her. Was there a chance for closure, for him to face her once and for all, to hold her accountable for her actions? Marcus' mind was spinning, but there was one thing he couldn't deny. This was a moment that could change everything. It had the potential to either heal old wounds or open up new ones. And despite his better judgment, Marcus knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to face this. That evening, he made the decision. He called her back. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before Eleanor's shaky voice answered. "Marcus," she whispered, as if unsure she had the right number. "It's me," he replied, keeping his voice steady though inside, his heart was hammering in his chest. "You said you needed help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could almost hear her struggle to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling more than he expected. I don't know who else to ask," she said. "I'm scared, Marcus. I'm not ready to die, but I don't have anyone. No one will help me. I thought maybe after all these years, you'd be the one to come through." Marcus clenched his jaw. The anger inside him started to bubble up again. The woman who had made his childhood a nightmare was now pleading for his mercy. It felt wrong, like a twisted joke. But as he listened to her voice crack with emotion, he realized that the woman on the other end of the line wasn't the same person he remembered. Something was different about her. The mask she had worn for so many years had slipped, and for the first time in a long time, she sounded vulnerable. Still, that didn't erase the past. That didn't erase the nights he had spent cold and hungry, wondering if anyone cared. The scars from those years weren't something he could simply forget. They had shaped him into the person he was today, and even though he had come out stronger, those memories still hurt. The idea of forgiving her, of even helping her, felt like an impossible choice. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice sharp. "You hurt me, Eleanor. You hurt me more than anyone ever did. So why now? Why are you asking me for help after all this time?" There was another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you, Marcus," she said, the words so soft they'd barely reached his ears. I was lost. I was trying to keep control of everything, but I wasn't strong enough. I thought I was doing what was best, but I know now I failed. I failed you, and I've been living with that every day. I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry." The sincerity in her voice caught Marcus off guard. He had expected more excuses, more of the same cold detachment. But this was something different. He didn't know what to make of it. Was it genuine remorse? Was she really sorry for the things she had done, or was this just another manipulation? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but despite everything, a small part of him felt a flicker of compassion for the broken woman on the other end of the phone. Was this his chance to finally get answers, to confront her about the years of torment he had suffered? Or was he walking into a trap, about to open old wounds that would never truly heal? Marcus didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. The real story was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus. His mind wouldn't stop racing. The phone call with Eleanor had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite explain. The apology in her voice had felt real, but could he trust it? Could he trust her? Years of anger and hurt lingered like a dark cloud over every thought he had, clouding his judgment. And yet, there was this nagging feeling, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself to confront the past once and for all. Marcus didn't know what he expected from the encounter: closure, answers, perhaps even a chance to yell, to finally make her see how much she had destroyed. But he knew that he couldn't avoid it forever. He couldn't keep running from the woman who had been part of the reason he had struggled for so long. His life had always been defined by the fear and anger he had carried with him from those years. And now, Eleanor was asking for his help, as if nothing had ever happened, as if the scars she left were just a part of the past. When Marcus finally called her back, it was clear she had been waiting. She didn't even let the phone ring for more than a second before answering. "You're coming, aren't you?" Her voice was hopeful, fragile, and it made him hesitate for just a moment. "I'll come," he said, his words firm despite the conflict stirring inside him. "But I'm not promising anything." The drive to Eleanor's house was long, and with each mile that passed, the weight of the past seemed to grow heavier. The memories of the old house, the creaky floors, the cold rooms, and Eleanor's stern face, all of it flooded back. Marcus found himself clutching the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His mind kept replaying the times he had hidden in corners, his heart racing, trying to escape the yelling, the punishments, the feeling of being unseen. The years of silence between them had been easier than dealing with the ghost of his childhood. But now, here he was, heading straight for it. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed that the house looked different. The once pristine, well-kept yard had grown overgrown with weeds. The windows, which used to gleam with care, now appeared dull and chipped. It was as if the house had aged along with its occupant, both showing the signs of neglect, of time spent withering away. Marcus's stomach turned. The house felt like a ghost of the past, both the place that had haunted him and, now, a symbol of the woman who had created his nightmare. Eleanor greeted him at the door. She looked older than he remembered, thinner, with her face drawn and pale, her eyes sunken in a way that made her look even smaller than she was. She was no longer the intimidating figure he had feared as a child. In fact, she looked frail, like a person who had spent too many years pretending to be something she wasn't. "Marcus," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. I didn't expect you to come." Marcus didn't answer at first. He stepped inside, looking around the house. It was eerily quiet, save the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. The air felt heavy with unspoken words. The house had always had an oppressive feel to it, but now it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. It wasn't just the house, it was everything. "You said you needed help," Marcus finally said, his voice colder than he intended. "What's going on?" Eleanor's eyes shifted nervously. She motioned for him to sit, but Marcus stayed standing. He wasn't ready to sit across from her like they were equals. Not yet. I don't know where else to turn," she said, her voice cracking as she sank into a chair. "I'm sick, Marcus. The doctors, they say I don't have long. And there's no one else. I thought maybe you could help me get to the hospital, help me make the right arrangements. I can't do it alone." Marcus stood there, unsure of what to do. The woman who had held him in a prison of fear was now asking for his help. It felt wrong. The whole situation was surreal, like he had stepped into a twisted version of his past. The pain he had lived through seemed so distant now, yet seeing her like this brought it all back. He didn't want to show any sympathy. He didn't want to let her think that all the years of torment could be forgotten just because she was ill. But part of him, a small part, couldn't ignore the vulnerability in her voice. He'd been angry for so long, but now, standing here, facing her like this, he realized that anger was just one part of the equation. He had been carrying it for so many years that it had become his armor, but now, looking at her, it felt like it was starting to crack. What did he really feel? "I don't even know what you want from me," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. You never cared before. Why should I care now?" Eleanor looked down, her hands shaking as she clasped them in her lap. "I know I didn't. I know I wasn't the mother you needed. I was wrong, Marcus. I'm sorry for everything. I wasn't prepared for any of this. I was too harsh, too cold. I was trying to protect myself, but I see now that I was only hurting you. Hurting all of you. And I can't undo that. I can't fix it. But I want you to know that I regret it every single day." Her words were heavy with regret, but Marcus wasn't sure he believed her. She'd have been a monster in his eyes for so long that hearing her apologize felt foreign, like it didn't belong in the same world he had grown up in. He had spent his life being shaped by her cruelty, and now she expected him to help her, to forgive her. Part of him wanted to walk out, to leave her to deal with the consequences of her actions. But another part of him, the part that had always wondered what might have been different if things had been different between them, wanted to know more. What had really happened? Why had she treated him so differently than the other children? The tension between them hung thick in the air, but neither of them spoke. Eleanor was waiting for a response, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and shame. Marcus was caught between his desire for revenge and his curiosity, between the need to stand strong and the faint possibility of forgiveness. Neither of them was ready for the truth, but the truth was closer than either of them realized. The silence stretched on between them, suffocating, as if the very air was thick with all the words that had gone unsaid for years. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of everything. Eleanor's apology hung in the air, but it didn't feel like enough. It never could be. The woman who had molded his childhood into something unrecognizable, something twisted, was now asking him for help, for mercy, when he had never been shown either. He glanced around the room, trying to distract himself from the emotions rising within him. The house seemed smaller now, more cramped, as if it too were a cage. His eyes drifted to the old photographs hanging on the walls, snapshots of smiling children in various stages of childhood, many of them familiar faces from his past. They had all come through this house, all been treated the same way. And yet, none of them had ended up like him. None of them had carried the burden that he did. "Marcus." Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts, and it took everything in him to not flinch. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve that. I just need you to help me now. I know I've hurt you. I know I scared you, but I'm asking for one thing. Just one thing. Please." Her eyes pleaded with him, desperation seeping into every word. It felt like she was reaching out, hoping he would somehow bridge the vast chasm between them. But how could he? How could he ever move past the... For a long time, Marcus had wondered what his life might have been like if he had been raised differently, if he had been shown love instead of scorn. He had fantasized about how he would confront her, about how he would make her feel what he had felt. But standing here, staring at the frail woman before him, he realized he wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, walls so thick that even now, as an adult, he couldn't fully tear them down. But in this moment, the walls seemed to shift, threatening to crumble with each breath he took. Eleanor's face twisted in pain as she spoke again. "I know it's hard to believe, but I'm not the same person I was before. The years have changed me, Marcus. I can see now how wrong I was, how awful I was. I was just too proud to admit it before." Her voice wavered, and Marcus saw the tears welling up in her eyes. He didn't know what to make of it. His instincts told him to walk away, to turn his back on her like she had done to him so many times. But another part of him, the part that had always wondered what was really going on inside her, couldn't ignore the sense of confusion swirling in his mind. Was she truly repentant? Was this all an act to manipulate him one last time? He took a step forward, his mind reeling, trying to process what was happening. The years of torment still felt fresh, like a scar that refused to heal. But Eleanor was in front of him, an old woman now, no longer the cold, unyielding force she had been. She was broken, vulnerable, and the thought of letting her continue to suffer made something shift within him. Could he really walk away from that? Could he live with himself if he did? The quiet in the room was suffocating now, the weight of their unresolved history pressing down on both of them. Marcus didn't know what to say, or even what he was hoping to hear. The years of emotional abuse, the neglect, the pain, it had all built up into something that couldn't be undone with an apology. He had worked too hard to move past it, to build a life where he wasn't defined by her cruelty. And yet, in this moment, he realized how little closure he had actually gotten. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he finally asked, his voice low and strained. "Why didn't you tell me why you treated me like that? Why was I different from the others?" Eleanor flinched at the question, her face pale. She looked down, as though struggling to find the words, and for a long moment, Marcus wondered if he would ever get an answer. But then, almost as if she had resigned herself to the truth, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "I thought you were stronger than the others," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was preparing you for the world. The other children, they were weaker. They couldn't handle the things I put them through. But you were different. I thought I was helping you by toughening you up, but I see now I was wrong. I hurt you in ways I can never take back." Her words hit Marcus like a slap to the face. He couldn't process it. The idea that she had believed she was doing what was best for him, preparing him for the world by tearing him down, seemed almost insane. How could she have thought that? How could she have believed that cruelty could somehow be justified as discipline? It didn't make sense. It still didn't make sense. And yet, there was a small part of him that understood. A small, deeply buried part of him that knew she had always been as broken as he was. She had carried her own wounds, and maybe, just maybe, they had shaped her in ways she couldn't even comprehend. But did that make it right? Did it change the fact that she had scarred him, that she had made his childhood feel like a prison? Marcus wanted to scream. He wanted to lash out at her, to demand answers, to make her feel the weight of what she had done. But something in her face, something in the raw, unguarded vulnerability she showed, stopped him. The woman who had once been a cruel, unfeeling figure was now pleading with him, not just for help, but for understanding. And Marcus didn't know if he could give her either. He felt trapped, torn between the anger that had festered in him for so long and the quiet, nagging sense of empathy that threatened to undo everything he had built. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm, and he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He didn't know what to do, what to say. The past was always going to be there, looming over them both. But as Eleanor waited for him to speak, her eyes filled with an unspoken plea, Marcus realized that the true question wasn't whether he could forgive her, it was whether he could forgive himself. And in that moment, he knew that the answer was still far from clear. Marcus stared at Eleanor, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. The room felt suffocating, the weight of her apology and the years of pain pressing down on him like an invisible force. He could barely breathe, let alone think straight. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to feel: anger, sadness, confusion, or something else entirely. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with unresolved tension, until a sudden noise broke through the air, startling both of them. A door creaked open from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, his instincts immediately going on high alert. He glanced at Eleanor, but her face betrayed no shock, no fear. In fact, she looked almost resigned, as if she had been expecting this. "Who's there?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp, his body tensing in response to the unfamiliar sound. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the hallway, her expression hardening for the briefest of moments. Then she shook her head, as if trying to dismiss the intrusion. "It's nothing," she said quickly, but there was something in her voice that made Marcus feel uneasy. It wasn't convincing. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure appeared in the doorway, someone Marcus had never expected to see again. Standing there in the shadows, just outside the room, was a man. His face was partially obscured by the dim lighting, but Marcus recognized him instantly. It was Robert, the man who had been part of the family during his childhood. Robert had been the one to stand by Eleanor's side, the one who had helped maintain the cold, oppressive atmosphere in the house. He was the one who had been complicit in the harshness, the neglect. But there was something different about him now. His once strong build had withered, and his eyes were hollow, like a man who had seen too much. His clothes hung loosely on his body, and he moved with a slow, deliberate pace that made Marcus's skin crawl. "I thought you'd be gone by now," Eleanor said, her voice colder now, though she tried to mask it with a thin smile. Robert stepped into the room fully, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "I wasn't going anywhere," he said quietly, his voice rough. "Not without speaking to him." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and anger. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Why was Robert here? Why now? Eleanor looked at Robert, her face hardening. "You need to leave, Robert. Now." But Robert didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer to Marcus, his gaze unwavering. "You don't know the whole story," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You never did." Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The words hit him like a punch, the weight of them hanging in the air. What was Robert talking about? What did he mean? "I've been trying to protect her, you know," Robert continued, his voice almost sounding pitying. "She didn't want you to know, but I think it's time you finally hear the truth." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The truth? What truth? Robert took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "The truth about why she treated you the way she did. The truth about the real reason you were different from the others." Eleanor's face turned pale, and for the first time since Marcus had walked through the door, she looked genuinely scared. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as though she couldn't stop Robert, couldn't control him, couldn't stop what was about to unfold. "I know everything," Robert said, his voice growing more insistent, his eyes narrowing. "I know what she did. I know why she did it. But you were just a pawn in a game that was much bigger than you ever realized. It wasn't just about you being different. It was about something much darker." Marcus could feel the floor beneath him shifting, the ground beneath him crumbling as Robert's words tore through the air. He couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. What did Robert mean? What was he implying? His pulse quickened, and his instincts screamed at him to get out, to leave before this became something he wasn't prepared for. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap, and for the first time, Marcus saw a glimpse of genuine fear in her eyes. "Robert, please," she whispered, her voice desperate. But it was too late. Robert wasn't backing down. "You think this is just about you and your mother, don't you?" Robert sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You think your pain and suffering were just some mistake, some twisted accident. But it wasn't. It was all planned. It was all part of something much bigger, something much darker than you ever imagined." Marcus's head spun, his mind reeling. He couldn't grasp what Robert was saying, the implications of his words sinking in slowly. He took a step back. Robert's eyes gleamed with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "I wasn't the only one who knew what was going on," he said softly, almost regretfully. There were others, people who wanted to control everything, who wanted to manipulate everything. You were never meant to have a normal life, Marcus. You were just a tool, a piece in a larger game. Marcus felt his stomach churn. Who are these people? His voice was barely a whisper, fear creeping into his words. Robert looked over at Eleanor, his eyes darkening. That's the thing, he said, his voice taking on a darker tone. They never went away. They're still out there, watching, waiting. The room seemed to close in on Marcus, the walls spinning as the true horror of what he was hearing started to sink in. There were forces at play that he couldn't even begin to understand. He had thought Eleanor's cruelty was the worst of it, but now he realized that the nightmare was much deeper, much darker than he could have ever imagined. And it wasn't just Eleanor who was to blame. There were others, shadowy figures, hidden forces pulling the strings. As Robert's words hung in the air, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about his life, about his past, was a lie. And the real story, the real truth, was just beginning to unfold. But the deeper he got, the more dangerous it became. Marcus's heart raced as the weight of Robert's words settled in. He felt like the floor had dropped out from under him, and his mind struggled to catch up with the dizzying revelations. His childhood, the years of abuse and neglect, had all been part of something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The idea that there were people pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating his life as if it was some kind of twisted experiment, made his blood run cold. Who are these people? Marcus asked again, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but it was drowned out by fear. The truth had been shattered, and now the pieces lay scattered at his feet. Robert stared at him, his face unreadable. It's bigger than you think, Marcus. These people. He hesitated, his voice lowering to a near whisper. They were always watching, always controlling things from a distance. And your mother, she was part of it all. She was never just a foster mother to you. She was working for them. The words hit Marcus like a slap, and he took a step back, struggling to make sense of what he had just heard. Eleanor, once a symbol of everything he had hated, now stood there like a shadow of her former self. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she watched the conversation unfold. She had been involved too. His entire life had been shaped by people he'd never known, people who had used him as a pawn in their game. I didn't know, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice cracking. She looked at Marcus with a pained expression, her eyes filled with guilt. I didn't know everything. They made me do things. They had power over me too. The truth hung heavy in the air, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to believe it, not entirely. He had suffered for so long, had fought to survive. How could he now accept that it had all been controlled, that his pain had been a part of someone else's agenda? Who are they? Marcus demanded again, his frustration rising. What do they want? Robert seemed to struggle with his words, his hands trembling as if he had never wanted to speak them aloud. They want control, Marcus, over everything. They want to shape the future, manipulate the weak, and create a world where they hold all the power. You were a part of their plan, but so was I. Marcus's mind spun as he tried to process the enormity of what was being revealed. He had been nothing more than a tool in someone else's game, and so had Robert, Eleanor, everyone who had come into contact with this mysterious group. But the worst part, he was still trapped in their web. They had never let go, not really. And then, just as Marcus was about to demand more answers, another voice interrupted the tense silence. Enough. The voice was calm, almost chilling, and it came from the far corner of the room. Marcus spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. He hadn't heard anyone else approach, hadn't even noticed the door opening behind him. But standing there, almost like a shadow, was a figure he couldn't quite place. The person was draped in a long, dark coat, their face hidden by a hood. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they stepped forward, their movements fluid, almost too deliberate. As they removed their hood, Marcus's stomach twisted. He couldn't believe his eyes. Standing before him was someone he had not seen in years, someone he never expected to encounter again. It was Alice, the woman who had been there when he was a child, the one person who had seemed to care, who had shown him kindness when everyone else had turned a blind eye. But now her face was hard, her eyes cold, and something about her demeanor made it clear that she was no longer the same person. "You," Marcus breathed, unable to process the sight of her. "You were part of this." Alice didn't speak immediately. She simply stood there, staring at him as if she was studying him. "I've been watching you," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been waiting for you to find out." The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. Alice, the one person who had made him feel seen, who had once given him hope, was connected to the very thing he had spent his entire life trying to escape. She had been involved with the group, with whatever shadowy organization had been pulling the strings all along. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Why would you do this?" Alice's eyes softened for just a moment, but it was fleeting. "I had no choice, Marcus," she said quietly. "None of us did. You don't understand. They control everything. They've been manipulating people for decades, and they won't stop until they get what they want. They're too powerful." "But why me?" Marcus asked, feeling his frustration boil over. "Why me? What did I ever do to deserve this?" Alice looked at him, her expression almost regretful. "You didn't deserve any of this, but they needed you. You were their experiment, just like the rest of us. They wanted to see how far they could push you before you broke, before you became something they could control. You were a test." Marcus's mind reeled as he took in her words. He had been nothing more than a test subject, a pawn in a game he didn't even know existed. And Alice, the one person who had ever shown him kindness, was a part of it all. He had trusted her. But now, he realized that trust had been a lie. "I didn't want to be part of it," Alice continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But I couldn't escape. None of us could. We're all trapped in this, Marcus. All of us." The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of the truth crashed down. His entire life had been manipulated, twisted by forces beyond his control. But now, standing in front of him, was the key to everything. Alice had been part of it, but she was also the only one who would help him break free. "Then help me," Marcus demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Help me stop them. Help me take them down." Alice hesitated, her face conflicted, but just as she was about to speak, there was a loud crash from the hallway, followed by a flurry of footsteps. Marcus whipped around, his heart pounding. Before he could react, the door to the room burst open, and several men dressed in black suits stormed in. Alice's face paled, and she took a step back, her eyes widening in panic. "It's too late," she whispered. "They found us." The men in suits moved quickly, surrounding Marcus and Eleanor, their eyes cold and calculating. They weren't here for answers. They were here to silence them. Just before the men could make their move, Alice lunged at one of them, knocking him off balance, buying just enough time for Marcus to break free. But it was clear now, this fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about taking down a system that had controlled his life for far too long. As the chaos erupted around them, Marcus knew one thing for certain: the battle for his freedom wasn't over. It had just begun. The room erupted into chaos. Alice fought fiercely, pushing the men back, giving Marcus just enough space to move. His heart raced, but he wasn't sure if it was from fear or adrenaline. The truth was out, and now it was up to him to make it count. "Move," Alice yelled, her voice desperate but commanding. She shoved one of the men to the side and grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him toward the back door. He barely registered the noise around him, the thuds of footsteps, the shouts, the frantic scramble for control. His mind was still reeling from everything he had learned. The people who had tormented him for years were not just individuals. They were part of a much larger, darker system, one that had woven itself into his life and the lives of others. It wasn't just about his past anymore, it was about stopping them from doing this to anyone else. But as he made it to the door, one of the men grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. Marcus swung out of instinct, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. The man stumbled back, giving Marcus enough space to push through the door and into the alley behind the house. "We can't keep running forever," Alice said, panting, her voice full of fear but also resolve. "They'll come after us. They'll never stop." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the alley. His instincts told him they couldn't stay in one place for long, but he also knew he couldn't just disappear into the night without a plan. He had to expose them. He had to make sure that the truth would be known, no matter the cost. "What now?" he asked, trying to steady his breath. "We have to take them down," Alice replied. "I've been working on gathering information for years. I knew something like this would happen eventually. I knew they'd come for you." Her eyes were locked on him, an odd mixture of regret and determination. "But I never thought it would happen this way. I thought we had more time." Marcus's mind raced. The organization Alice spoke of had been orchestrating his entire life from the shadows, and they weren't just going to let him walk away. He had no illusions about the danger they were in now, but he also knew that this wasn't the time to back down. "We have to go public," he said, his voice unwavering. "We need to expose them. Everything. Their entire network. They can't get away with this." Alice's expression hardened. "It won't be easy. They've infiltrated every level of society, government, corporations, media. We're dealing with something bigger than just a few corrupt people." Marcus felt the weight of her words. The challenge ahead of them was enormous, and the danger was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. This was bigger than revenge. This was about something more important: justice. For weeks, Marcus and Alice stayed on the move, staying off the grid as much as possible. They worked together to compile evidence, speaking with those who had been affected by the organization's reach. Alice's contacts, though few, were invaluable. People who had once been part of the system, but had turned against it. Together, they pieced together a damning trail of corruption and manipulation. Every day, the stakes grew higher. The organization had its claws in everything: government officials, police officers, media moguls. They were everywhere. But Marcus couldn't back down. His life, his entire existence, had been shaped by their influence. If he didn't expose them now, he knew that more people would suffer just as he had. One night, after weeks of planning, they managed to leak the evidence to a trusted journalist who had been investigating the organization for years. It wasn't just a matter of publicizing their crimes. It was about starting a movement, igniting a fire that would burn through the network of corruption. They weren't just revealing secrets. They were giving a voice to the countless victims who had been silenced for far too long. The release of the information was explosive. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the entire world was talking about it. People came forward, sharing their stories, connecting the dots that had been hidden for so long. It felt like the world had finally woken up to the reality that had been lurking beneath the surface, a reality that had been carefully controlled by a powerful and dangerous organization. But even as the truth spread, Marcus knew that their fight was far from over. The organization fought back, trying to discredit the evidence, threatening anyone who dared speak out. It became a battle for survival, but Marcus was determined. He'd lived through too much to let them win now. The people who had hurt him, who had manipulated him, were finally being exposed for what they truly were. And that, no matter how hard the fight was worth everything. In the days that followed, the world began to change. Governments were forced to investigate, officials were arrested, and people who had once been complicit in the organization's actions were now being held accountable. Marcus's name became synonymous with courage, with standing up against the darkest forces in society. But for Marcus, the most important thing wasn't the recognition. It was knowing that his past, the suffering he had endured, had led to something bigger, a chance to bring justice to others who had suffered just as he had. As for Eleanor, she disappeared. Whether out of fear or guilt, no one knew. Marcus never heard from her again, but he didn't spend much time wondering. His focus was on what came next. The organization had been dismantled, but there would always be remnants of it, pieces of its influence that would try to resurface, and Marcus would be ready for them. The final piece of the puzzle came when Alice, exhausted but resolute, turned to Marcus one last time. "We did it," she said, her voice soft. "But it's never truly over, is it?" Marcus smiled for the first time in a long while. It was a weary smile, one full of scars, but it was genuine. "No," he said, "but we'll keep fighting." And as the world began to heal, as the truth continued to spread, Marcus knew that he had finally taken control of his own life. The scars of his past,